Hallelujah. We're really blessed tonight to have with us Anna Eisen. And Anna's actually got with her husband, Jared, and daughter, Erica. Son-in-law, I apologize. Erica and Erica's husband, Jared. I apologize. And, but welcome. And you know then that this is Anna. And Anna is an acclaimed author. She is the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and she'll tell you her story. Nick and Dr. Rudolph and I and some others had the opportunity to hear her share a few months ago. We were really blessed, and so that's what gave rise to this evening's event. Anna is one of the past presidents of the Colleyville Synagogue, Congregation Beth Israel, which is, of course, the synagogue that experienced that horrific terrorist tragedy on January 15th of last year. So it's just literally a one-year anniversary, memorial, or whatever the right word is there. But would you please make Anna welcome?
I can stand. Oh, I can go anywhere? Well, I have to see what's on the. I'm good. Do you think lights can go down? Okay. We want to do presenter view so you don't see all this. Nope, they're still singing. Okay. Great. Okay. Thank you very much. It's great. I can move around. I like that. I want to start by saying that during the Holocaust, those long and terrible years that my father endured, and I'll share that story with you, him and his fellow prisoners each made a promise to each other that if anybody should somehow survive, that they would one day tell the story of what had happened to them. And my father's dream was that one day good people without fear in their hearts would gather to hear what they had been through and would care. And that somehow, if this would happen, it would be a miracle. And today, by you being here, you are indeed a part of that miracle. And so I thank you. Now it's on. So growing up, I really didn't know anything about the Holocaust. I was born in upstate New York, and it was something that my parents really never talked about. When I was about 5 years old, we moved from upstate New York to the Maryland suburbs. And probably when I was about 7, I started to realize my family was different. My parents spoke 5 languages. They had heavy accents. We had no photographs of relatives because on my father's side, at least, we had no relatives. And so I began to, ask my father questions about, relatives or his background. And I would see a real look of anguish come across his face. And I knew that I was touching upon something that I shouldn't. When I was about 7 or 8, I remember going into the den, looking for a deck of playing cards. And I reached my hand into a side drawer, and I felt 2 stiff pieces of paper. And I pulled them out, and they were watercolor paintings. The first one was very graphic and vivid and frightening to me. I mean, as a young child, I'd never seen anything like this in a school book or a storybook. And they were signed by a name, L. Zaltzman, that I didn't know, and dated Neustadt, 1946. I mean, I could see that there were scenes of violence and there were soldiers. And the second painting was equally frightening and disturbing. Here was a young man kneeling before a pit of bloody bodies, and both of them were signed by this name, L. Zaltzman. But even though I was about 8, I knew that I had probably found something I wasn't supposed to. So I just quietly put them back in the drawer and never brought it up to my parents for 30 years. I kept my father's secrets and kept the pact in my family not to bring up the war. And soon I started hearing new words, boxcars, camps. But I kept quiet, and secretly I went on my own to the school library. I remember finding a book, and in the back there was a black and white photo of one of the camps being liberated. And there was piles of bodies being bulldozed. And I wondered, is this it? Is this the secret? Is this my family? But I wasn't going to upset my parents, so I didn't say anything. In 1984, when I moved to Texas, I discovered in Dallas there was a Holocaust museum. And there, walking down the steps through a boxcar in the bottom of the Jewish Community Center, I found the answers to all the questions that were just in my heart. Not only did I learn about the Holocaust, but I became a docent there at that museum and gave guided tours. Not long after, I started interviewing Holocaust survivors for the Steven Spielberg Shoah Foundation. And it was during one of those interviews that I decided that I didn't want it to be some stranger asking my father his story, that I wanted it to be me. So I went and I confronted him. And I told him all I knew about the grandmother I was named after was that she died in a gas chamber, and that wasn't enough. And I wrote this poem that was published at that time about that confrontation with my father. And this is just a part of it. My father says he is Adam. Nothing came before him. But I stand behind my father, push him back, explain the savage scar, the broken teeth, the fear of cold and loneliness. Take me to the graves and down the railroad tracks. So I asked my father if he would please take me to Poland. And being the loving and generous and wonderful man he was, in 2 weeks, my whole family was on a plane. And he would be our guide. We would go to the major places to understand what happened during World War II and the Holocaust, to Warsaw and Krakow and to major cities. But we would also go to this town where he had been in the ghetto in Rzeszów, and to the town that he had grown up in Tichin. We went to Auschwitz, the famous camp, where I walked along the railroad tracks and tried to understand the experience of the 1.1 million Jews killed there, including 232,000 children. Most, 90%, were set to death immediately. Here I took a photo inside a barracks where I tried to comprehend what it was like to spend bitter, horrible, cold winters in a place like this, without blankets or proper clothing. In some of the small communities, we visited empty synagogues like this one, where the arcs were open and dark and empty, and they had cutouts of Jews standing in prayer to try and teach people what this vanished people were like. Here in the front of the photograph is my father and mother and one of my brothers. In the markets, I was shocked to find these kind of figurines for sale. Little Jews with stereotypical features, holding musical instrument, prayer books, and of course, yes, little bags of money. The old tropes and stereotypes still exist, and they're for sale. We went to my father's town, and here he walked in front of the old yellow building that had been his elementary school. We went by some of the homes that still stood of his friends like the Tuchmans, where he shared the stories of what had happened during his childhood and the early years during occupation. And even though he said he didn't want to and swore he never would, we found ourselves going into his childhood home, walking up the stairs with a man who had turned it into a boarding house. And I found myself standing in my grandmother's kitchen, trying to imagine her there, trying to imagine having a grandmother. We went into the town hall, and upstairs in a little closet, they had remnants of the tombstones from the Jewish graves. And we were shocked when they showed us a box full of drawings from the Jewish children from before the war, and inside was one signed by his friend, Tuchman. We walked down by the creek where my father explained his family had gone to hide all during the night when the Nazis came to town and would go around arresting or beating or taking away the Jews. And I learned who my father was. My father was the artist. He was Lutrin Zaltzman. Here in one of the only photos that we have of him as an infant, with his father Herman, who was a lawyer, my grandmother Anna, that I'm named after, and his brother Monik, who was 6 years older than him. Later in life, after his book came out, my father returned to drawing pictures without any artistic training to try and tell the story of what he had been through. Here, his town of Tichin, where you see Jewish children playing in the street, people walking to the synagogue, and he remembers a life that was normal and safe and for the most part happy. But in September 1st, 1939, everything changed when the Nazis came and occupied Poland. Immediately, some of the men were arrested, including my grandfather, and taken to a Gestapo prison who may have tried to resist. Jews over the age of 13 were forced to wear white armbands with a Star of David and often forced to do just humiliating work to condition them to obey. My father remembers women being forced to get on their hands and knees and scrub the streets with just rags or toothbrushes. They went into the synagogues and took the Torahs out and set them on fire in the street. And then there was a decree put up and posted that on one morning, within a week's notice, all the Jews would have to gather in the town square with whatever belongings they had left and could carry, and would be forced to march to the nearby Rzeszów ghetto, along with people from other towns. Here, 23,000 Jews would be forced into a small, crowded area where there was great hunger, deprivation, illness, and brutality. Near the ghetto, Daimler-Benz, who makes Mercedes, had come in and taken over a Polish factory to make aircraft engines. At the time, some of the Poles who were working there had fled. There was not enough food, and they didn't want to be conscripted for labor. So Daimler-Benz was allowed to get approximately 500 Jews to work in the factory. Among them was my father and his brother. The rest of the Jews in the first week of July in 1942 were all gathered and forced onto boxcars. They were told that they were going to be sent to abandoned farms where there would be food. But the truth was they were just sent a few miles to the nearby Belzec extermination camp, where all of them were gassed on the same day they arrived. Thus began my father's journey as one of the 465 Jews in the, I don't know why the F is dropping off, that worked together through 10 concentration camps over 3 years in Germany, Poland, and France. The first camp, because the Germans Germanized the names of all the towns and ghettos, would be Reichshof. Here my father worked sweeping the streets, and even though he was 14, he became a lathe operator, working a drill press. His brother, who worked in a different part of the camp, was able to escape and join the resistance in the war. They made a pact that if either of them were to survive, they would get to New York, where one relative had managed to get out. After a while, the SS took over the camp and said no more Jews are allowed. So these Jews were put on trains and sent away. The first camp they went to was Płaszów, right there near Krakow, made famous in the movie Schindler's List. This camp was built on the grounds of 2 former Jewish cemeteries, and my father drew and remembered when they would have to dig up the graves with shovels or even with their bare hands. From Płaszów, they were sent to Wieliczka, where he labored in the salt mines. From Wieliczka, they were sent to Flossenburg in Germany. Here he worked, and if they were too weak to do the heavy labor, they would often be shot on the spot. My father in his drawings often included his own prisoner number. And here on the bottom left, the prisoner bent over with a shovel bears my father's prisoner number, 16,019. He was always, it seems, trying to tell his story, even when he couldn't bear to speak the words. From the Flossenburg camp, they were sent to France. Here, near Colmar, there was an abandoned tunnel that the Nazis took over and put the equipment to make the aircraft engines inside. This camp was called Orbis. And still to this date, inside, it is painted on the walls, here worked 462 Jews from Poland, because 3 had died. But as the Allies approached, the equipment was destroyed, and again, they were put on boxcars and sent out to another camp. Back into Germany, they were sent first to Sachsenhausen. Here, my father drew this picture of memory. These are French resistance prisoners, not Jews, who were forced to march manacled in a circle all day long, with a T on their forehead that stands for Tod, which means death in German. At the end of the day, one would be chosen to be hung. And every day, this terrible and brutal, torturous march would go on. From there, they went to a camp called Wattenstadt, another German camp. Here, the group would be divided into two. Some would go to Bremen and some would go to Braunschweig. Another prisoner named Joseph Singer approached my father. He pleaded with my father to change positions with him so he could stay with his family. So my father agreed, not knowing what was the right thing to do. And so for a short while, my father became Joseph Singer. This man who took my father's name did not survive the war. So my father went to Braunschweig, this camp in Germany. They were there a short while and then sent to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was primarily a women's camp, the largest women's concentration camp, but they had a small sub-camp for men. My father remembers at this point there was no work, the war was almost over, little food, and they would see the women prisoners in their dresses, their prison dresses, standing at the fence. This was one of the only, if not few times during the Holocaust that prisoners received Red Cross rations. The Swedes had come in thinking the war would be almost over and tried to negotiate to get some of these prisoners released. It didn't happen. But one day there was a German soldier who allowed them to go and get some rations. This has been documented by the U.S. Holocaust Museum and in many books. Of course, my father remembers that he was so weak at this point. He couldn't carry a box, let alone a can of food, but he got some crackers, some powdered milk, and some cigarettes and chocolate, and this helped him stay alive. And from there, they went to the final camp, Webelen. Webelen in northern Germany was a sub-camp of Neuengamme. Many of the concentration camps had many, many subcamps. All told, there were more than 44,000 concentration camps, transit camps, subcamps, and ghettos. This camp was only open 10 weeks, and when my father arrived, it wasn't even complete. Most of the buildings had no doors and no windows, and as you can see in this picture, the bunks weren't even done, and they just slept in the mud and straw on the floor. On the night of May 1st, again, they were put into the boxcars. But the boxcars didn't leave. Later, we didn't find out whether the tracks had been blown up, whether the locomotives didn't arrive. And on the morning of May 2nd, the boxcar doors were open and they were pushed back into the camp. There were guards in the tower shooting at them. And my father ran and tried to hide himself, just laying in the dirt. But soon it was quiet, and when he lifted his heads, the guards were gone. And a miraculous sight. 7 or 8 American soldiers on the morning of May 2nd, 1945, had come across the camp accidentally and liberated the camp. Young men were in green uniforms with helmets and radios, and they were free. Here, a photo of my father taken by the 504th of the 82nd Airborne, second from the right, Lucian Zaltzman, May 2nd, 1945. My father would remain in displaced person camps, DP camps, for 2 years. He kept sending letters with American soldiers to his one uncle who had gotten out, but he didn't have an address. And somehow, after 2 years, he received a telegram saying that we will take you to us, you'll be coming to America. And this document on the left is from the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, that highest, and this was in lieu of a passport, that he would be traveling in 1947 at the age of 19 from Bremen on the Marine Flasher to America. Here's a photo of my father on the ship. We have the original manifest. And of course, my father saved for all the years of his life the little piece of paper where he had drawn again a little photo of the boat to commemorate that special journey. In America, my father came, he had a 5th grade education. He was delivering buttons, trying to learn English, and as a permanent resident, he was drafted into the U.S. Army. He went from the barracks and uniform and roll calls of the concentration camps to the barracks and uniform and roll calls of the U.S. Army. But he always felt so grateful and that America was indeed his partner. He felt welcome. He felt respected. He met and married my mother, also a Holocaust survivor, and using the GI Bill, he went from 5th grade straight to college, where he earned a bachelor's in physics, a master's in engineering, and had a long and successful career at the Pentagon. Together, he started speaking, and we wrote his book that just was published in the 20th anniversary edition with a foreword by Michael Berenbaum, who was the man who curated the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C. and, in fact, also designed the Dallas Holocaust Museum. And yes, just 3 days ago, it was named a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, which I'm just sorry he wasn't here to see it. It is a big accomplishment. All these miracles happened after the book came out. We wanted to have that photo of him taken by the soldiers in his memoir. And the University of Wisconsin Press, who was our publisher at the time, said, well, we need to check the permissions. So the photo my father found in the War Library at the Pentagon in this book called The Devils in Baggy Pants. And that was the name that was given to them by the Germans. The parachutists would be flying down with their big pants, and that was their nickname. And the 504th proudly carries it to this day. In the book, the permissions editor found her father's picture. He had been one of the 7 or 8 soldiers who liberated my father. He had never spoken about the war, and then when he was ready to, he suffered a stroke that left him unable to speak. So we came and shared the story with CNN, who took us, and shockingly, one of the sons had from the father the Nazi flag that had flown over the camp. Here you see my father holding it and just sharing the memory of that day of liberation. I don't know if anyone knows, in Colleyville, there was a very famous man who lived there named James McGillis. Maggie, we called him. He is and was the most highly decorated veteran of the 82nd Airborne and a Medal of Honor nominee. I met him, and he was one of the 7 or 8 soldiers who liberated my father. I introduced them, and they became lifelong friends. Here in the middle photo, they traveled together to Germany, to the camp where they had met across the barbed wire for a special ceremony. And here's a picture of me and Maggie. I last saw him when he was 101. Wow. He died 2 years ago at 103, but because of COVID, his funeral was delayed. So just this past Labor Day, I went to Arlington National Cemetery to be at his burial with full honors. And I know my father would have wanted me to be there to pay respects. My father passed away in 2016, and I took the vow to tell his story so that it shouldn't just go into the silence and disappear forever. I heard about the Arlson Nazi archives, and I started doing some research about my father. I looked up his name, Lucian Zaltzman, and found him with his date of birth and all kinds of amazing records. Here, the original Ravensbrück prisoner list. I found an original list from the Flossenburg concentration camp with his number 16,019. This incredible list with his beautiful handwriting, an original list from when he was in the concentration camp in France. Prisoner number 33,339, Lucian Zaltzman, born January 7th, 1928. I discovered a post-war card that listed all 10 concentration camps he was in with many of his prisoner numbers. Here in the first camp, Reichshof, you note that he had a very low number, 222. Remember that number? Because there was only 465 prisoners. Other things I discovered going through the archives, a hand-drawn map by an American soldier. On the side, he writes Rabaruska, a town, Belzec, the extermination camp my grandparents were in, Treblinka, at the very beginning, just trying to sort out and figure out and find space on this map for all of these places where so much murder and suffering had taken place. On the cover of the Flossenburg list that was compiled after the war, I read a letter and this paragraph from an American soldier. If a thought may be interjected, it is hoped that these volumes will prove of help to those who suffered, as well as those who want to prevent a recurrence of such suffering, and that it shall never in the future again be necessary to report such history. And that's why the research, the documentation, our work at Holocaust education is so important if we can learn from it. I discovered this original document, the bread list, from my father's final camp on his final day as a prisoner. Across the top, the last days of May and May 1st. But the next one that says May 2nd is blank. There was no bread because that was the day that the American soldiers arrived, and instead my father found freedom. During research, I discovered many new things. When they were put on those trains on May 1st, they were supposed to be going along with all the other subcamps of Neuengamme to Lübeck Bay. Thousands of prisoners were sent on that day, May 1st and May 2nd, when my father instead was liberated. And what happened? A very famous story. All the prisoners were put on two ships that were mistakenly sunk by the British, and 6,000 prisoners drowned, were burned to death, or shot trying to swim ashore. My father was supposed to be among them. When my mother came to live with me a few years ago when COVID began, we had these documents and special things that we found among their belongings. My father's post-war concentration camp inmate ID, a small diary and calendar, and these black and white photos from other people in the displaced person camps. My father had always talked about some of those other young men from the ghetto and the tent camps and liberation, and how they had helped each other to stay alive, sometimes by sharing bread, sometimes with an encouraging word, sometimes by just telling my father not to give up. And when I turned over the photos of Moses Zimmern, Itzik Rip, Motek Hofstetter, Tobias Newson, Moses Tuchman, I realized that these were not just names, these were real young people. And so I set out back in the Arlson archives to look for them. I was shocked to discover this document with a specific number, 465 Hafling, prisoners, Juden, Jews from Reichhof. My father's name, third from the bottom. I went back now again and looked for his friends and found their prisoner numbers, their date of birth, their names, the town of origin. And I started finding more records. Each of them had these yellow cards from the Flossenburg prisoner camp. These were their possession cards, which of course were all completely blank. But I also found these post-war cards. This one here from Moses Tuchman, listing the same camps, Plaszow, Flossenburg, Colmar, Sachsenhausen, Neuengamme, and where he was going to go afterwards, to New York, to his uncle. Tobias Newson, also the town of birth, and I was able to match the signatures. So I knew that the person from Flossenburg who was on the list was the same one, because there are hundreds of thousands of documents in the archives. There's actually millions, but many are not yet digitized. So I set out looking for them on Ancestry, on Google, on Facebook, every way possible. I went looking for these 7 men or their families, and I found all of them. Wow. And we had this reunion in New Jersey where we zoomed in from Israel and Sweden. We met in person, never believing that one day the children of these 7 men who had been together in 10 concentration camps and liberated together would all meet. None of them knew their father's stories. They knew they had been in camps, but their fathers, like mine, had not spoken. And even more heartbreaking, many of them, as very young fathers, had died of cancer, probably because working in the salt mines, the stone quarries, the DDT, who knows what the exposure that they had had. But we formed a new bond of friendship and a new way to understand and remember our father's story. I also found out what happened to my father's brother. He never showed up in New York. But doing the search, I found this post-war card that Monik Zaltzman, son of Herman, a student from Tichin, was alive in 1946. And I went through the Shoah Foundation tapes and archives, and I found a man in Chicago. He had listed Montague Zaltzman in his record. His two brothers had been with my uncle in the woods in the resistance. They had survived together, but they were in Poland after the war, where my father was in a displaced person camp in Germany. One of the brothers had a sister who had left her newborn baby girl on the doorstep of a local family to be hidden, to try and save her during the war. She died. She was hiding in a barn and the farmers turned them in. But the brothers and my uncle went looking for her. And someone in the house who didn't want to give over the child, who was now 2, through a window, had a gun, and my uncle was shot and killed that day. But I stayed in touch not just with that man, but I discovered that young baby girl who now took my uncle's name as her own. A word about my mother. This photograph of her on the top right was taken a week after the hostage situation at my synagogue. She was 99 years old, and the next day she would be 100. And it was the first Friday night Sabbath service we were having after the hostage situation. And she said, "If you don't take me, I'm walking." Wow. So we went. This is her that night before her birthday, and Rabbi Charlie called her up. We sang happy birthday, and he said, "Ruth, tonight is a night of survivors." And I researched her past because she never talked about it. I didn't know my father's real name, and I didn't know her real name. I found a woman who wrote a novel and has another one coming out based on her life. My mother's family was in Poland from Tomaszów Lubelski, and they ran to the Russian border and somehow were able to cross into the Soviet Union. But they refused to become citizens because they wanted to leave when the war was over. So they were all arrested and sent on trains to Siberia, where she was in a gulag for several years. After the war, she returned to Poland, and she was recruited to join the Bricha. Bricha means escape, and this group, which was set up from the kibbutz at that time, Palestine, were helping the survivors leave Europe, and they were also going to look for the children. 85% of all Jewish children were killed during the Holocaust, so they felt it was their mission to go and find these children. I researched and found on the top left her photo in the Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel. There she is, the only blonde in the group of secret operatives. And on the bottom left, she donated 16 photographs herself to the U.S. Holocaust Museum. Here she is on the bottom left with a cape. And these are some of the orphans and children that she helped rescue and collect after the war. So I wrote the book with my son, the follow-up book, Pillar of Salt. Here on the top, a very favorite photo of mine, him walking with my father in step at the Majdanek concentration camp, having the kind of conversation that I couldn't have. And now we're in the final phases of producing a documentary film that will be out this spring, geared toward the next generation with 2 and 3D animation, artistry, music, and hoping to bring the story alive in a new way. And of course, what happened at my synagogue. I was the founder of Congregation Beth Israel after I came back from Poland. And I said, I've been to a country full of empty synagogues and no Jews, and now I live in a community with Jews and no synagogue. And standing in my synagogue, because I was in charge of the remodel, 4 days after the hostage event, with all the broken glass and destruction, it just brought me back to the same feeling that I had when I was in Poland. But I took a vow that day to continue forward, that we won't live in fear and we will not be defeated. I was invited to go to the Senate confirmation hearing of Dr. Deborah Lipstadt. She was a professor at Emory, is the eminent scholar on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, and now is the U.S. ambassador, the envoy to combat and monitor anti-Semitism. Who was my father? My father was Lucien Zaltzman. When I look at his photograph next to his drawing, I can't help but see the resemblance and really believe that he was trying to tell his story even from those early days when he was just 17 years old. Looking closer at that same painting, I see a young man with a yellow star and the number 222. And in the notebook I got years after his death, I see that same star with the same prisoner number And I see under his name that he has not forgotten the name of Joseph Singer, who traded places with him and maybe died in my father's place. And who was my grandmother? Well, I learned about her from my father's stories and from these letters I discovered with the heavy hand of the Nazi censors. She was a woman who bartered and traded and sold everything they owned in their house just for a few potatoes. She was a woman who went to Rzeszów and pleaded and begged and found some noble Christians who were able to secure my grandfather's release from the Gestapo prison. And she was also a mother, so strong and loving that on the last day they parted, she convinced my father to stay behind in the ghetto because she thought that maybe, just maybe, that would give him a chance to live. And he did. Thank you for letting me share my story.
We want to give an opportunity for questions. Just as you're formulating them, I'm reminded of Heschel's book, An Echo of Eternity. And he says at the beginning, God looked at everything, he said it was good. And he said, but there's never been a point in history since then.
Right.
When God could say, everything's good. Yeah. So we want to give an opportunity for questions. If there are none, I have some, but.
Questions, comments?
Onyx, let me give you.
So my question is, how do we help now? Like, I know that a lot of the people from the Holocaust have passed away or they're quite elderly. How do we help now? Because I know it's being forgotten and people are talking about like it never happened. And my heart burns to help, but I don't know how. And so that's my question.
Well, I think that's a great question. How do we help? I mean, I think the important thing is that we learn from the past. I mean, this is why you study the Bible or study the Torah, right? I mean, from our history, we learn the lessons. And I think that, you know, in Europe, I've worked with some French filmmakers, and in Europe, the young people know more because they were occupied countries. So when you go to France or go to Germany or Poland, there are concentration camps. But in America, our liberators, our soldiers after World War II, were not encouraged to speak. It was very much the be strong, move forward. Even today, you know, we have a World War II museum in Louisiana. The monument in DC that I've been to two 82nd Airborne National Conventions as a guest, is just a monument. So I think that education is the answer. Education about the Holocaust that's now mandated in 17 states, education about World War II, education about racism. You know, when I go into the schools and the young people are asking, you know, about Kanye West, and I say, well, let's talk about Jesse Owens. Let's talk about what happened in the Olympics. They don't know about this. So I think encouraging history, education, and discussion, but, you know, understanding that one-to-one, if you hear someone say something, of course, you know, we want to challenge it and say, you know, that's unkind, but it's also now gotten bigger so that, for instance, they're now doing training for corporations, for the Dallas Cowboys, you know, trying to make it clear that hate and this kind of language, you know, is not acceptable. But the internet has made it widespread. So I think we have to, you know, there's a famous artist, Jackson Pollock. I don't really like his art so much or understand it, but he would just throw everything at it, you know, just all the colors. And I think we have to throw everything at it on an individual level, you know, through the church, through organizations that are doing this, through reading, you know, whatever we can do. But it's not just anti-Semitism. It's also hatred of all kinds. Bullying of all kinds is just growing. I think that we have to try and create a world. You know, the Holocaust shows us the worst of humanity, and we need to live and model the best of humanity.
Anna, we have a question from our folks at NRH. So one of our folks asked if the 44,000 concentration camps were all for Jews, or were there other people groups in those
So that's
places?
such a great question. there were 6 million Jews, the approximate number, and 9 million victims. And my father in many of the camps was with non-Jews. And he writes about it in his memoir. Norwegians, Poles, political prisoners. I mean, there were priests that were shot and executed for trying to hide Jews in the convent. Anybody who spoke out, even within Germany, they had the White Rose organization. So it wasn't just Jews. At the beginning, it started at Hadamar with the euthanasia of people who were disabled and mentally handicapped. It was Freemasons, it was homosexuals, it was widespread Roma and Sinti, who were, back then called gypsies. We don't use that language anymore. So no, it was, Hitler occupied more than 20 countries. So he did that because he wanted world domination, not just because he was trying to murder all the Jews, although that was a separate goal that he had because he saw Jews as a race. And so by going where you had one grandparent, he was trying to eliminate, the bloodline. But, of course, now we know with the ancestry and all this that, I have, 22,000 relatives. Some are just a tiny bit of DNA, but it's not a bloodline. It is a faith and a people that you can be a part of or not be a part of. But a great question. Thank you for that.
Will you please raise your hands if you have any questions?
The White Rose Society, could you tell us about it?
I don't know a lot about the White Rose Society. I know it was, do you know something about it? You could share. I know it was an organization of young people in Germany. They were caught and they were trying to assassinate Hitler, that there were pockets of people. And I also want to say that even though this happened, I work closely. I'm an ambassador now for the Arlington Nazi Archives, and I work very closely with them. And I admire what's going on in Germany. If you show a swastika, it is a criminal offense according to their penal code. And so I think that in America, yes, we believe in free speech, but I think, the internet and inciting violence has kind of changed that. So I think that I don't harbor any ill feelings toward the Germans of these generations or other countries, because I see that it's an individual thing, how hard they're working to try and learn from this, preserve the documents, preserve the camps, and teach it. Of course, there's still people who are, maybe anti-Semitic, of course, and prejudiced and bigoted, but I think we're going to see that, in every community and country. I think right behind you here. She's the keeper of the microphone. I won't.
Thank you so much for sharing. My name is Paul, and I'm 55 years old, so I've looked through school. They taught about the Holocaust, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know very much. I feel really that I should know more, and so you've inspired me. My question is, and I'm thinking the answer, there may be many answers. How do, the family of the Holocaust survivors view Christians and maybe Christianity? Okay, so it's said that Hitler was a Christian. If he was, that's Roman Catholicism. We're Reformed and biblical Christianity. I'm just trying to figure out the relationship. Do Jews look at Christians and say, you helped kill my family? Or I'm sure you know what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, and the answer is, I can only speak from what I've read. First, let me just say that if you go to the Dallas Holocaust Museum and other places, you'll find that that's expanded. It's now about civil rights as well. It's about genocide in other countries as well, because it's not just history anymore. It's current events, and we have to make it more universal, the lesson. As far as the Christianity thing, at least what I learned from my father is it had to do with people that saw a segment of the population as less than human. It wasn't about whether they were Christians or not, because even at one point at the end, my father says in his book, when they were forced out of the last boxcar that last day, they were Christians. When he said all Jews step forward, there were Christians pushing the Jews out of line, and there were Christians pulling them back in line. So it was really both. And what he used to say is How could it be that fathers who were Nazis would go home and tuck in their own children and at the next day at work kill other people's children? So he didn't see it as something that could be blamed on religion. He saw it that people were willing to be radicalized, as we see now today. If you look at ISIS and what they can do even on a small scale when they would set people on fire, I mean, that people could be radicalized, that they would believe the propaganda, that it can be so easy to hate, especially when you see people as less than others. You don't feel that, we are all each other's brothers and keepers, and that we have to, cherish life and not be evil and murderous. So I think it crosses all boundaries more ethically and morally than was something that he ever blamed on religions. As a matter of fact, there were people throughout the war in his book, Christians, that it could have been a small thing. They threw him an apple. And even though his teeth were broken and fallen out, it was like the greatest gift for a man who was starving.
Hi, Anna. I have several questions for you. I hope you can remember them.
I hope I can answer them.
I need the answers.
Okay.
There is no substitution monetarily or in any other way for the atrocities that have happened to my Hebrew brothers and sisters. The first question I have for you is, has Daimler-Benz ever offered or have been made to acknowledge its participation in the Holocaust? That's the first question.
I'll answer them one at a time because I won't
Okay.
remember. So yes, as a matter of fact, I have an amazing letter that my father wrote to Daimler-Benz saying I was a slave laborer and what are you going to, and their reply was that we were part of this war and we have contributed to funds and restitution. And if you go to the Daimler-Benz just site, they have, pages on their history with pictures of the camp, and they admit that this was something in their past. There were some restitution funds. My father, for almost all of his life, could never get restitution funds because you had to somehow say you were somehow affected mentally or mentally deficient. And because of his high clearance in the Pentagon, he would lose his security clearance in his career. But yes, they did admit to it. And there are many books now, Mercedes in War, Daimler-Benz and the Third Reich, and they have opened up their archives. And yes.
My second question, I only have two more.
Okay,
I need these answers.
I understand.
Who in America that looked like me has had the unction to go outside the church walls, not stay in the church walls, or even if they're secular people, to speak out publicly and righteously, look like me or others in the room, about these atrocities that can circumvent and shut down the Kyrie Irvings, the Louis Farrakhans, and the Kanye West?
So the educators, I mean, I've done education for the Tennessee Holocaust Commission, for the state of Louisiana, for Maine. And when I go and meet with the educators, they're not Jewish. They are of all backgrounds, all ethnicities, but they're passionate about this and teaching it. And education, is the answer and is the key. I went and, was the keynote in Beaumont for 450 people. There's only 80 Jews in all of Beaumont at their temple. 2 bishops there, 40 parishes represented from the Catholic Church. And so there's a lot of people that care about this. And it's important to also understand that the role model for good, what happened during those times, is as important as learning about the evil that took place. But I think it's the educators and the churches. I was just at another church and I said, who are we going to turn to teach these lessons of love, brotherhood, kindness, goodness? The politicians? I don't know. I don't hear too much of that. But I think it has to be the schools and the churches. And in the schools, there are many that are working, but it's difficult. There are difficulties in the schools because parents have a lot of concerns that, what their children are learning. Are they ready? Are they too young? I mean, I will tell you the truth. I mean, both of our books are rated for age 13, but there are some states that have a Holocaust mandate that says that it has to be taught in the 5th grade, which I think is a little too young. It's too young, not just that it's shocking, but also you have to be a certain level of maturity to try and process this and understand how it's going to affect you as an adult, that you have a civic, moral, maybe spiritual responsibility to speak out, to be a good person, to think about others, not just about Jews, but also, how are we treating people in other issues such as immigration? These are complicated things. You can't just throw an answer against the wall. So.
And my last question is, with the rise of anti-Semitism being the way it is, why is there no prosecution for the persecution of the Jews, of course other people, but my focus are the Hebrew brothers and sisters? Who do we hold responsible for lack of prosecution, and how do we make them accountable to start prosecuting?
Well, there's a couple things. So number one, if someone does a violent act, they can be prosecuted as a hate crime, which has a minimum sentence of 10 years or more. And part of what's going on now, what's going to happen at City Hall in Dallas on Wednesday, is adopting the UNRWA, the UN definition of what is anti-Semitism. And that's a question to understand. What is anti-Semitism? Is it a swastika? Is it bullying? When does it cross over? And actually, under the new definition, Holocaust denial is considered now anti-Semitism. So I think it starts, thank you, with education. And I think that, there's difficulties. It's so complicated. I mean, my daughters here went to the South Lake schools. We're in South Lake, and my father spoke there when he was alive. And, I run into people all the time who say, oh yeah, my children heard your father speak and heard you speak. But South Lake School District just took religion out of their code of conduct as what is considered, a violation. They took out other things as well, but they say, well, it's implied. Well, now it's a gray area. So I think that, and my book was just now approved by the Texas Holocaust Commission. There's a Senate bill, in the state, it has to be approved by them before it can be brought to schools. So, and that's why we're doing the film, to find new ways to get the story out without too much violence, without nudity, without graphic depictions. And I think it starts with education. When and I know that Pastor Stone asked me to share this, my experiences when I moved to Texas was not, for the most part, overt anti-Semitism. People might just say they didn't know what Jews do. They didn't understand our language. We didn't celebrate Christmas. They'd never met a Jew. Of course, I remember when I had one at the intermediate school, and I thought it would be a really good idea to get them to play a Hanukkah song during the Christmas concert, and they did Hava Nagila, and that kind of backfired because it was like, what the heck is this? Why are we playing this weird song? It's that Jewish kid. So that didn't work. But after I started the synagogue, and I worked very hard to be a leader in the community. One morning, about a week after Christmas, I went outside my house in South Lake, and my front lawn was covered with about 10 discarded Christmas trees. Somebody had come in the night and stood them up all over my front lawn. And the police called it, this is before hate crimes, religiously motivated vandalism. And I called up a Christian friend because I didn't know any Jewish people that had a pickup truck. And I said, I need help, and I was embarrassed to say it. And this man came to my house, very successful, worldwide prominent businessman, and wouldn't let me lift a finger. And he cried. He felt so bad because no matter what I had done, I was the Jew in town. But for the most part, it wasn't like that. There was bullying in the schools. There was some name calling. And that's why I think between the families, the schools, and the churches, we have to do what we can. That it's just, to be kind, even if we're different, that we have to be kind. We have to be respectful and understand the consequences. When we see that, and I'm also a licensed therapist, and I worked 5 years inpatient. I was a child assessor for ages 5 to 18. And we see that, suicide in those ages is the second leading cause of death. So, and it's from bullying, it's from despair, it's from unhappiness. So we have to work to make it safer for everyone to be different, to be who they are. Any other questions? Yes, there's a hand up.
One more.
Our reading today was from Exodus. Does that hold any resonance to you?
Does Exodus hold any resonance for me?
The Israelites were oppressed by a nation for hundreds of years, but God reversed it.
Well, that's an interesting twist at the end. I mean, all of the Bible resonates with me. And it's in my book. We named it 23rd Psalm, Pillar of Salt. I look to religion to try and understand this. And I've even said, if we were like rewriting the Bible now, and we had a sixth book, because there's only 5, it would probably be the Holocaust, because never has there been such a mass murder of people, of Jews slaughtered for being Jews. But, I've heard others say, where was God during the Holocaust? And then the answer which resonated with me was God turned around and said, where was man during the Holocaust? That really it was us. It was us. It was our job to not do this, to prevent it, to learn from it. But sure, I'm not sure what the question was. What resonates in Exodus? Mizraim, we're in the wilderness. There's difficulty. We struggle. We turn to God. God doesn't always answer. Job, every single part of it I learned from. But the thing about the Holocaust that I find that is the most difficult for me is that there doesn't seem to be a bottom. That the more I read, the more stories, the more people I talk to. I know, even on Facebook, I get the most meaningful, powerful comments. Children of American soldiers. My father never spoke about it. He was always so pained, and then the terrible stories, meeting this young baby who was in 6 or 7 orphanages and grew up not knowing, and then wondering why she was left behind. And after my uncle was killed, they never came back for her. And so she had this terrible life, and then didn't even know that she was Jewish till during the Korean War. One of the brothers went and found her, in a Russian orphanage. So it feels like there's no bottom. Like the more I look, the more the pain, the stories. Now we're categorizing and digitizing records from the Arlson archives. And when you come across cards that say Jacob, 6 years old, or whole families, the pain can be very deep and very difficult.
I got one question in regards to it.
Okay, this will be the last question.
The last question.
Have you ever run across the Paper Plate Project in Tennessee?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. You can tell them about it, but it's where it was school. They were teaching on the Holocaust, and they were telling the children about all that, and they couldn't figure out how many would be 6 million people, and so they started collecting paper clips. And the news caught wind of it, and there was a couple that went and got a box car and brought it over, and they just made a little memorial for them.
You explained it. There's a lot of ways to try and conceptualize and teach the vast numbers. But what's interesting in Tennessee, because I do their training, in their mission statement for the Holocaust Commission, they state specifically that we want to focus on telling the individual stories. Because when you say there's 6 million, 44,000, this, that, the numbers, ghettos, and you just generalize, it's really hard to understand. But just like when we say the homeless, they're just out there somewhere in tents. But when you focus on the suffering of one person, what it is to be cold, to be hungry, to be alone, then our hearts are open, and we want to go and collect socks for, everybody. No one should be cold. But that's what we have to do. And that's what we tried to do with the books and the work that I'm doing. And the film is tell through my father's story, the experience of a family, a young boy, and what he experienced in all the camps. So
Thank you so much. There's I'm gonna because we'll just keep going if we do another one. Let me encourage you instead to come see Anna during the Onig time.
we have the books for sale, and there's also a bookmark. The bookmark has my website. There's a teaser for the film. There's all the artwork and documents can be downloaded and shared if anyone wants any other groups or schools. But you can also, my email's there, so you can feel free to email me. Just say where you met me, so I don't.
A couple other things. There's a movie as a follow-up you might want to watch. PBS did a movie a number of years ago called God on Trial.
That was great.
It's really good, yeah. So we actually watched it at King's. Dr. Jeffrey Seif had us
Should have
watch
had
it.
me here. That was great. I would love to talk about that.
It's a great movie, God on Trial, and
A group of prisoners, as they're about to die, put God on trial and try and debate out their faith or lack of faith. And then I won't
Really
tell
good.
what happens at the end, but it's
really good.
mesmerizing.
Secondly, another follow-up thing. We do a Holocaust trip to Israel. We had to stop because of COVID, but the next one is in October this year, October 20th to November 2nd. And we actually do go, and 50% of the trip is touring, because we're in Israel, you're going to tour. And 50% of the trip is actually loving on Holocaust survivors. We get in their homes, we listen to their stories, we just love on them. And that's
And children of survivors.
yeah, and children of survivors, yeah. Yeah, and so
Well, I want to thank you guys for having me here. I've had a great, I'm so glad to get to know you and Nick. And I don't know, is David here? I didn't see
no,
him.
I don't see him.
I will send him an email saying you were AWOL, but, and also Wayne for your hospitality.
Wayne here.